Alright, today we're going to talk about why the fine-tuning argument is not only not very good, but is actually really quite bad indeed. This is a follow-up to the previous video I did, so I recommend you have a watch of that first. Not strictly necessary, but it will give you the kind of background that I will be appealing to in this video. First of all, let's just do a quick recap of what the fine-tuning argument is before I get on to why it's really quite bad indeed. The standard model of fundamental particles is a description of the fundamental laws and operations of those laws in describing how our universe works at the most basic level. So it consists of a number of fundamental particles, including electrons, quarks, photons, and things like that, and describes how they interact with each other. Part of the standard model is 31 fundamental constants. These include mostly constants from particle physics as well as some from general relativity. Around half a dozen or so of these constants are thought to be relevant to the question of whether life is able to exist, whether it's possible for complex life to exist in our universe, particularly things like the mass of the electron and the dark energy density. Now, the basic idea of the fine-tuning argument is that the probability that these constants took on the values that they do that allow life to exist, given the laws of physics, so we assume the laws of physics are fixed, is very, very low. And again, that's something I've discussed in the previous video, so I'm not going to go through the evidence of that here, but that's the substance of what the fine-tuning argument is saying. It should be noted that when we talk about probabilities in this context, these are epistemic probabilities, so even if it's the case that the constants couldn't have been any other value, they're necessary. Nevertheless, the argument goes, we can still ask conceptually, as far as we know, the constants could have any value, and so epistemically speaking, it's sort of improbable that we would expect to see the universe actually have a set of constants that allows life to exist. And so the question is, how can we account for this apparently very low probability under naturalism? But, so the argument goes, the probability of having life-allowing constants, again, given the fixing the actual laws, and given theism, is not very low. And therefore, if you take the ratio of these probabilities, the probability of life-permitting constants under theism compared to the probability of life-allowing constants under naturalism, the idea is that that is much, much greater than 1, which provides support for the proposition that theism is true over the contrary that naturalism is true. So this is the substance of the fine-tuning argument. The fact that the constants fall in the very small range of values that permit the existence of life is evidence for theism over naturalism. But what we're going to ask in this video is, how is this probability derived, the probability of life permitting constants given theism? Usually this isn't discussed very much by theists, only usually being the subject of a few short sentences to explain why this value is at least not very, very low. But I'm going to question that in this video and essentially argue that this value is vanishingly small, far smaller than the probability of life permitting constants under naturalism. And therefore the fine-tuning argument, if anything, is actually evidence in favor of naturalism rather than theism. But we'll get to that in due course. So to answer this question of where this probability comes from, the probability that we would have life-permitting constants given theism, we have to ask the question, why would God fine-tune the constants in the first place? Now, theists typically claim that God creates the universe and fine-tunes it and so forth because of the moral value of human beings, and maybe other forms of life as well, but particularly human beings. Now, I'll take as an example of this Swinburne in his book, Is There a God? I've seen a number of theists reference this book as an example of a discussion of why God would want to create a universe and fine-tune it for human beings, and so I'll take this as illustrative of the type of argument theists give. So these are a couple of quotes from that book. Quote, "A world containing human persons is a good thing. Persons have experiences and thoughts and can make choices, and their choices can make big differences to themselves, to others, and to the inanimate world. God, being perfectly good, is generous. He wants to share, and there is a particular kind of goodness in human persons with bodies in a law-governed universe." End quote. And another quote, "It is up to us whether we choose to learn and extend control, and up to us how to extend knowledge. Like a good parent, a generous God has reason for not foisting on us a certain fixed measure of knowledge and control, but rather for giving us a choice of whether to grow in knowledge and control." End quote. we will return to these underlined sections in a moment when we discuss the different mental properties that God has in mind or would have in mind when deciding what type of life to create. But at the moment, we just want to emphasize that the argument here is that God would create, or would want to create, have reason to create a world that has humans in it that can experience, that can think, that can learn, that can make choices, and can do good or do ill for themselves and also for others in the world, and learn and grow in their control and interactions with others. So these are the types of reasons that God is considering when he's determining what type of life to make, according to theists. Now, let's consider another question. Does God make physical or non-physical minds? In his book, Swinburne emphasizes the importance of minds being able to interact with each other in accordance with laws and regularities. But this, in fact, is not an argument for God making physical life, because most types of laws and regularities are not physical. It's sort of trivially easy to realize this or to determine this. For example, Swinburne believes in God, and he mentions in his book, maybe ghosts exist. Well, both of those entities, if they exist, have causal powers that allow them to interact with other entities or with other substances, even though they lack bodies. And really all you need to do to have regularities is to have certain types of causal powers. So if laws are physical, if we have a physical reality or physical minds, the way I interpret that in this context is that there are particles or fields which interact with each other by exchanging conserved quantities, like electric charge, mass, energy, and so forth. These interactions are what is described by our best quantum field theories and the general relativity and such. So that's what I mean here by physical laws. Non-physical laws, on the other hand, are any type of regularity in which substances interact with specific causal powers. So God is supposed to be an entity that has, in effect, all causal powers, all possible causal powers. He can do anything, right? Whereas if there are ghosts or immaterial minds or demons, magical forces, whatever other types of immaterial entities might exist, would have their own specific causal powers that allow them to interact with each other in particular ways. Illustrated here by the idea of an immaterial mind that has different components or different facets of intellect and so forth. So these are our two different possibilities here. We could have minds that are physically embodied, physical minds, whose regularities are described and constrained by physical laws based on particles and fields interacting through exchange of conserved quantities, or we could have non-physical minds which follow non-physical laws based on which particular causal powers they are endowed with by God. So those are our two possibilities here. And the essential question we're going to ask is, of all the different types of minds God could create or might have reason to create, how many of them will be physical compared to non-physical? What proportion of them will be physically instantiated? So in order to answer that question, we have to make a few assumptions, and these assumptions I'm making are taken from the fine-tuning argument. So they're supposed to be assumptions that essentially help the theist, or the theist typically makes in presenting the fine-tuning argument. So the first assumption is that God has a reason or desire to create things that have moral value. This is something that I raised in my previous video where I questioned whether an omnipotent and omnipresent and entirely self-sufficient God would have any reason to create anything at all, but here we're just going to assume that he does. The second assumption is that minds are sufficiently morally valuable to be the sort of thing that gives God a reason to create them. In the previous video, I raised the question as to whether God might want to create other things, but here we're just going to assume he wants to create minds. And often I'll talk about kind of human minds, but that's not essential. You can imagine different types of creatures as well, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. The third assumption is that God may create physical or non-physical minds. So theists, again, typically assume this by appeal to the fact that God is a non-physical mind, and humans clearly have physical minds, or at least partly physical minds. I mean, that's the whole point of the fine-tuning argument, right? That it's that we need a physical instantiation for us to exist in a physical universe. Now, whether or not there's a non-physical component to humans as well is sort of beside the point here, as long as we at least need a physical substrate. So that's the sense in which humans clearly need physical bodies, physical minds in our universe. Even if you're a dualist and you think that there's a non-physical component, there's still clearly a physical component, and that's where the fine-tuning argument comes in. Now, the false assumption is that any physical minds that do exist must arise through reductive physical processes. Now, this is an assumption that certain non-physicalists about the mind, such as emergentists or perhaps panpsychists, maybe some types of dualists might disagree with. But the reason for this assumption is that you really need this assumption for the fine-tuning argument to make any sense. Because if you assume that even with our set of laws and constants as they exist in the actual world, God can just make embodied conscious life irrespective of the constants and laws, then there's no reason for him to fine-tune at all, because it doesn't matter what the fundamental laws are. The whole point of the fine-tuning argument is that you can only get life through a bottom-up process, through interactions of certain types of fundamental particles. And if those interactions aren't conducive to the existence of life, then you can't get life, right? So this assumption is really there to help the fine-tuning argument, because without this fourth assumption, the fine-tuning argument completely collapses, right? And the fifth assumption that we're going to make here again is typically made by proponents of the fine-tuning argument, that they just hold the laws of physics fixed as like the actual laws of physics. In other words, they consider imagining different values of the constants, mass of the electron and so forth, but they assume that the actual laws of physics, the equations that describe their interactions, are fixed. We will relax this assumption a bit later, but we'll start with that because, again, that's typically how the fine-tuning argument is presented. Okay, so with these assumptions, let's continue with the question as to what different types of minds might God have reason to create, and how many of them would be physically instantiable, given the assumptions we just made there. The key question is how many different types of minds and how many of them are physical. And this is really important because theists typically don't really talk about this much at all. They sort of assume that, oh, well, if God wants to create minds, then he'll just sort of have to create physical minds. Or maybe there's some non-physical minds that he could create, but there can't be that many of them, and so it doesn't change the argument very much because the fine-tuning argument still gives really tiny probabilities. But I'm going to question this assumption. In fact, I'm going to argue that the number of possible types of non-physical minds that God could have reason to create, as far as we know, it far, far exceeds the number of physically instantiable types of minds that God might have reason to create. So let's start counting these possibilities. In order to count the number of possible naturalistic universes, the way that the fine-tuning argument does this, again, because that holds the equations that govern, that constitute the laws of nature fixed, it just looks at the values of the constants and the range of these constants that would permit the existence of life. So this is just an example figure that I've used in the previous video to illustrate how this is done. The exact values don't matter here. The point is that you have a range of values that the constants could take. This relates to like the mass of different fundamental particles. And then these curves here represent the possibilities that are conducive to the existence of life, specifically this shaded area here, potentially viable for the existence of life. And because these are log axes, the idea is that, well, the range of life-permitting values is very small compared to the overall range of values that, as far as we know, the constants could have. Remember, this is an epistemic argument, as far as we know, not necessarily saying it's actually possible, but just as far as we know, the values could fall in any of these ranges. We have to discover what they are, right? And so therefore, we should be sort of surprised to see that the very small range of constants that permit the existence of life is what the actual constants fall in that range, right? That's the essential logic of the fine-tuning argument. So to establish the range of possibilities under naturalism, we take the laws, the equations as fixed. We look at the constants that are put into those equations, and we consider the range of possible numbers, as far as we know, that those constants could have that are consistent with those laws. If we're going to follow the same procedure under theism, as I argue we should compare like with like, so we should assess the range of possible theistic universes in the same way that we assess the range of possible naturalistic universes. Now, the key difference here, and this is, I think, a novel contribution as far as I know that I'm making to the discourse, is that that God would differentiate universes not by physical parameters, because he doesn't necessarily care, at least so as far as the theists say. God doesn't care directly about the value of physical constants. What he cares about are the morally salient properties of minds in those universes. So this is what I call mental properties. These are aspects, properties, facets of the minds that God is thinking about creating or might have reason to create that could differentiate their moral value. So these mental properties essentially determine the full set, the range of possible minds that God could create or might have reason to create. And the idea is that only some of these sets of mental properties will be physically realizable. I'll explain that in a moment, but that's going to be the an analog of the naturalistic fine-tuning argument. Instead of looking at which sets of constants in our physical equations are consistent with the existence of life, we're going to consider which of the combinations of mental properties would be physically realizable. Okay, but what are these mental properties and how can we evaluate them? Well, I've compiled a list based directly on the Swinburne quote, which we saw before, which, remember, told us that God creates embodied life for the purpose of gaining experiences, exercising its intellect, making choices of good and bad that affect other people and allow them to grow and develop in the world. So all of these different aspects that are important for life can be understood in the context or understood as mental properties. So the first one here, qualia intensity. So you can imagine God creating minds that have different capabilities of experiencing qualia. A qualia is essentially an experience that has a felt experiential component to it. It feels like something, like seeing a color or banging your arm or tasting a food or something like that. It feels like something should be in that state, right? And presumably, God is interested in creating life because it experiences things. But of course, we know that qualia, that experiences come in different intensities. There's different types of experiences and there's intensities of each of those experiences. You can start from sort of the barest twinge of heat or of touch that you can just barely make out in your arm to incomprehensibly intense pain or pleasure. That's a range we can imagine as human beings, but conceptually speaking, that range could extend far, far beyond the smallest intensity that we can even perceive or remember experiencing, out to really arbitrarily high levels of pain or pleasure that no human is even physically capable of experiencing. So this is important. Obviously, you can't imagine what it would be like to be in these experiences directly, because that's sort of how qualia are. You have to be in them to understand them. But conceptually, we can imagine having much, much higher or much, much lower intensities of qualia than anything humans or even other animals can experience. So this is one type of mental property, again, taken directly from the idea that God wants to create life because of the importance of experiences. And then there's intellect, right? So again, Swinburne talked about the idea of exercising intellectual capacities. And this is one where it's very easy to see what the possible range is. I mean, I've just said here, goldfish to gods. Again, it could be as wide a range as we can conceive of. Obviously, even in our own physical world, there's a range of different intellects, but we can imagine much, much more intelligent beings than exist in our physical world, and potentially less intelligent beings as well, if we're going to combine that with the idea that, well, we could imagine forms of life which are much more primitive, much less developed than humans, but still have a degree of capacity for moral choice, say, more so than any existing animals do. And this is the key thing that I want to emphasize here. We shouldn't restrict ourselves to just types of life that actually exist on Earth, right? The whole point is we're trying to conceive of the range of possibilities that God has before him. And so there's a vast array of possible intellects that God might have reason to create, and a vast different combination of possibilities when combining the different range of intellects with other mental properties. And that's the point we'll get to in a moment. So another mental property, lifespan. So this is very important when it comes to learning and growth, which is a feature that Swinburne emphasized. So humans can live from, well, I don't know, a few days if you die shortly after birth, but you're not really a moral agent at that point. So humans only become a moral agent after having lived for a few years, up to, 120 at most. There could be a much, much wider range of possible lifespans and time for moral agents to actually exercise their intellect and exercise their capacities for acting in the world. So there could be only enough time for a few thoughts and then it's over. Again, that doesn't really happen with humans because you don't become a moral agent until you've already lived for a few years. But you could imagine different types of agents that have a much, much shorter lifespan that God might have reason to create. Or you could have beings that lived for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, millions of years, that were eternal. Again, God could have reason to create any of these as far as we know. So there's clearly a very wide range there. And you can, again, combine that with any of the possibilities in terms of intellect or any of the possibilities in terms of the intensity or qualia that these beings can experience. Now, communication, so interacting with others, was a key aspect that Swinburne identified as being an important characteristic that God is interested in creating. And again, this is one where maybe it takes a little bit more imagination, but just think about this in terms of how easy it is for humans to communicate. So we communicate primarily by talking to people, and usually that goes fairly well. Remember, of course, that most people on Earth don't speak the same language as you, so that kind of limits communication. But even there, it's very common for humans to misunderstand each other, particularly in details and subtleties, and often when communicating emotionally charged issues. Just think about how difficult it is to have conversations, with maybe a family member or a significant other when it comes to differing opinions about something, whether it's a political issue or whether it's just a minor dispute about something around the house. It kind of often doesn't go very well. There's often miscommunications and misunderstandings. So you can imagine beings that were much, much less capable of communicating than humans were, where it was far more difficult to communicate the ideas. I mean, humans are limited in the rate that we can communicate and the fidelity we can get across ideas, but it could be even worse than it is. Like, imagine if you had to essentially write a letter and it took 6 months to arrive, and that was the only way to communicate with people. Like, God could create beings who had the equivalent of that difficulty in communication if he had a reason to do so. Maybe there's moral goods that are exemplified only when communication is that difficult. Taken to the other extreme, you can imagine much, much easier communications. The full extreme would be effectively full and constant telepathy available, connecting minds with each other. This wouldn't necessarily meant that the minds were joined. They would just have complete and ready access to each other's thoughts at all times, right? That would be the far extreme in the other direction, and you could have a vast array of gradations in between. And there may be very different types of moral goodness that were instantiated by different beings that have different types of communicative abilities with others. The extent of moral luck is something that I think is incredibly important. Obviously, Swinburne doesn't mention this directly, but he alludes to it when talking about the importance of interacting with other people in the world and then choosing to do ill or do good for that world. And moral luck, I think, is incredibly important here and something that is really not discussed very much when theists talk about God's purposes in creation. The idea of moral luck is effectively how much is our actions on the world in terms of whether they're judged as good or bad and the praise or blame that they attract. How much of that is affected by circumstances that are completely outside of our control, that are just luck. The classic example of this is a drunk driver who, drives home and drives through a red light. Actually, they don't have to be drunk, but like someone who drives through a red light, whether they're drunk or whether they're just tired or not paying attention. You drive through a red light, nothing happens, and you get home, right? So most people would say, well, you shouldn't have driven through the red light. But we generally wouldn't give the person that much opprobrium compared to the case where there happened to be a child walking across at night, and because the driver wasn't paying attention and they drove through the red light, they hit and killed the child. Now, that is an offense that you could send someone to jail for, and that would generally attract much greater opprobrium. And of course one can give different examples if the specifics of that don't appeal to you intuitively, but the point is that many of our actions in terms of how much blame or praise they attract are determined by luck. And there's many other aspects of luck that affect morality as well, such as how you're brought up, for example, and the education you have access to that extend this issue more broadly. Now, God may have reasons for creating a universe that has a large extent of moral luck, and he may have reasons for creating universes that have a very low extent of moral luck. In our universe, it's very often unclear what the consequences of our actions will be, and so there's a huge degree of uncertainty and just chance to it. Now, God may have had reasons to create that. He may have reason to create a universe that has even less clear outcomes, or one that has much clearer outcomes, where it's always very clear what the moral impact of any given choice will be and how much blame and praise it should attract. And so this is a very important issue if God has reason to create for the purpose of allowing people to exercise their agency in interacting with each other. And there's a vast array of possibilities there depending on the types of laws that God establishes in that universe. Related to but distinct from this is what I call ease of harm, and I'll just put its corollary up there, ease of helping. So these relate to the capabilities of agents to interact with each other. And again, Swinburne emphasized this as an important component of God's reason to create. This is distinct from moral luck because it's not an issue of how important chance is, but it's actually the degree of ability to help and harm other people. And again, this is something theists seem to not really think about very much, but it's really important when you're thinking about creating a world. How easy are you going to make it to harm other people and to help other people? In our world, it's surprisingly easy to harm other human beings, or animals as well, but particularly focusing on human beings. Basically, if you pick up a heavy object and you hit someone with it over the head, there's a strong chance that you could kill them. So it's kind of crazy how easy it is to do such harm. Not advocating that, of course, but just emphasizing the point that if God did create this universe, he's chosen a very particular value of this property of difficulty, or in this case, ease of harming other people. And of course, we can help other people as well. Often it's harder to help people than to harm them, but it does depend on the context. And you can imagine different sets of values of these parameters in which God made it much, much easier to help people, or made it much, much more difficult to help people, and vice versa. Another way to look at this is to think about people like Hitler, who were able to cause extreme hardship in the world based on their ability to communicate ideas and convince other people and influence the policies of states and start wars and things like that. If God had set up the causal order differently, that could have been much, much more difficult. It could be much, much harder to starve people or to order them killed. Or it could be much easier. You could do it just by thinking, right? Just by thinking in the right way, not even having to convince other people. Or you could think in the right way and give them enough food to survive. God couldn't create any logically possible universe that he likes. And so these are all on the table when it comes to the mental properties that God could create with agents in that universe. And I call them mental properties because they're potentially different causal powers that God could imbue agents in this world with. He has all the options available for any types of causal powers and the extent of those powers that he wants to impart to beings in this universe. So these are 7 that I have derived on the basis of, say, Swinburne and his remarks. Each of these has a potentially extremely wide range. It's impossible to quantify directly, of course. We don't have enough information about that. So what we need to do is compare the number of different sets of mental properties that could exist given our existing laws of physics, but potentially with different constants and different initial conditions. So we fix the laws, we potentially allow the constants and initial conditions to vary. How many different sets of mental properties, and therefore how many different types of intelligent life, could exist within our universe, again, with the laws fixed? And that effectively represents the number of physically instantiable types of intelligent life. So of all of the different types of intelligent life that God might have reason to create, there'll be some subset which is physically instantiable given our current laws of physics. What we want to do is compare that physically instantiable subset with the total set of all sets of mental properties, or all different types of intelligent life that God may have reason to create. And as I've said, it's difficult to do this quantitatively because we don't really know what range these properties could exist over, or what proportion of them would be physically instantiable given our current laws, but potentially allowing the constants to vary. And so for the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that each of these different mental properties has a total range of possible values that is 1 million times larger than the subset, the range of each of those properties, which is physically instantiable given our current laws of physics. And obviously this is an average over the 7, so there's probably a much bigger range that's possible, for example, with lifespan, or probably qualia as well, since there's no real limit to how intense qualia could theoretically be. Maybe the limit's a bit smaller for other things. Now you might be wondering, well, how do we know really what proportion of mental properties are physically instantiable given our laws of physics? And as I've indicated, the answer is, well, we can't really be sure about this. But remember, the fine-tuning proponents regularly tell us that if you tweak the constants of nature, or at least some of them, even by a small amount, you will end up with a universe that is not hospitable to any type of intelligent life. And certainly we know that if you tweak the constants just a little bit, you're not going to be able to get the types of radically different mental properties instantiated that God might have reason to create, as we've just talked about. So I'm just applying directly the same logic that fine-tuning proponents say when they claim to know that, well, if we change the constants just a little bit, our current form of life would be impossible in this universe, and there wouldn't be any other forms of life that would be possible. Well, if that's the case, then it follows that the vast majority of possible types of mental properties, types of intelligent life that God may wish to create, would simply not be possible to instantiate in our universe, even if you were to change the constants. And this is really a fairly simple conceptual point, that the types of states of affairs, the types of minds that are possible in our current laws of physics, even if you allow the constants to vary, is just much, much smaller than the total set of things that are possible for God to do if he doesn't have any constraints on him, like if he can create things in any way that he likes, particularly if he can create things without any physical substrate, whatever. And so I think it's very reasonable to assume that there's at least a factor of 1 million difference between the number of possibilities that God could instantiate within this universe, given our laws as they are, and the total range of each of these mental properties that he could instantiate, given no restrictions at all. So then, taking these estimated 1 in a million figures for each of the 7 mental properties, that multiplying those together gives you 10 to the 42 distinct sets of mental properties. Now, of course, we could argue about the exact number. I'm just illustrating here that applying the same logic that is developed in the physical fine-tuning case, we get a very, very large range of possibilities. And importantly, we get the result that the number of sets of mental properties that are possible to instantiate physically in our universe with the current laws of physics is much, much smaller, a tiny fraction of all of the possible sets of mental properties that God might have reason to create, which effectively leads you to a fine-tuning argument in reverse against theism. That is, if we make the assumptions that we began with and assume that God wants to create a universe with embodied life in it, overwhelmingly you'd expect him to choose a set of mental properties that is not physically instantiable given our laws of physics, because the vast majority of such different possible sets of mental properties are not physically instantiable given our current laws of physics. So let me just make a few additional comments on these ideas of mental properties. So all of these properties are conceptually distinct, and as far as we know, God could instantiate all of them at whatever values he wanted to. And so they all need to be considered. Now, under naturalism, there's a certain relatively small range of intellects that are possible, lifespans, communicative abilities, and so forth that are possible in our universe with the constants as they are. And if we move too far outside of that particular set of mental properties will no longer be instantiable in our universe. But under theism, God could make whatever set of parameters he wished. He's considering the reasons he has for creating life that has any particular combination of these mental properties, and then he's going to create the one that he has most reasons to actualize, right? And in doing so, he's not, at least this is the hypothesis, he's not so bothered whether the set of properties is one that's physically instantiable or not. He's just going to create the one that he has the most reason to. But it gets even worse than that for the theist, because it's not just the case that God is thinking about which set of mental properties to instantiate, of which, again, there are a very large number, but it's not actually clear that God would want all of the beings that he creates to have mental properties from the same set. In other words, each being could have a different set of mental parameters. So just to explain what I mean there, so this is very different to under naturalism. Under naturalism, the whole point is that there is one set of laws and one set of constants that every mind that ever exists in the universe, if there are any, must obey. All of the life in a given universe is made up of particles that interact in accordance with the same set of laws. That's the whole idea of the fine-tuning argument and how life comes to be under naturalism. But under theism, that assumption is completely unnecessary and unwarranted, because there's actually no reason at all why God would necessarily create forms of life that would all have mental properties that would be instantiable under the same set of physical constants or physical laws. So God could create a universe that has different types of minds, none of which could coexist in a physical universe. Maybe they could exist in their own physical universes, like separately from each other, but God could just create them all in the same universe and endow them with whatever sets of causal powers and properties he wants to, and then have them interact with each other. As long as there's no logical impossibility there, God is able to do that. He can create a being and endow it with whatever set of mental properties and powers he wants to, and he doesn't have to worry about whether it would be possible to instantiate those all within the same physical universe. He's just going to decide whether that's something that he wants to do given the moral reasons for that particular set of mental properties. And so I illustrate that in the bottom here just by indicating that it's not like under naturalism where we just have one set of physical constants that we're worrying about. Under theism, there's kind of one set of mental properties for every being that God wants to create, because as far as we know, God actually has different reasons for creating this being to compare to that being and the next being and so forth. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that he has a separate set of mental parameters for every different mind he creates, but there could be many different types of minds that he wants to instantiate, each of which has a different set of mental parameters. We already see that in our own physical universe, where there's different types of animals. But as I argued before, the range of mental parameters, the mental properties that is possible within our universe is really very low. There's not actually much of a range that is possible given the full range that we can imagine if we allow ourselves to consider things from a God's eye point of view. So I've sort of given an illustrative calculation here that if we take the rough estimate of the total number of human beings that have ever lived, just considering human beings for the sake of argument here, which is about 100 billion, so 10 to the 15, and then we argue that, well, as far as we know, if God, let's say God wants to create 100 billion different minds, he may have a different set of mental properties that he wants to instantiate for each mind. Now, he might not, right? Like, we don't know. Maybe he would choose to have them instantiate all the same set of mental properties, but there's no reason to assume that. He could want to have each of those minds with a very different value of those different properties that we talked about before, different possible lifespans and different possible intellect and things like that, right? And again, it's true that there is a range of those within the current physical universe, but the point is the range is tiny compared to the possible set of the values that those properties could take, and most of those will not be instantiable in our physical universe. So the total number of sets of mental properties that God could want to instantiate, like considering all the different minds that he might want to create, is 10 to the 42 to the power of 10 to the 15, which gives us a really obscene number. Now, do I think that this is, in some sense, the actual probability of God creating a particular combination of mental properties given a certain set of beings? Well, no, because I'm just using these values to illustrate the point that there is a vast array of possibilities that God could create and may have moral reasons to create as far as we know. And that's the key point that I'm emphasizing here. If we consider for the theist in the same way that we do for the naturalist without God, then we see that actually the range of creative options is much, much greater for God than it is under naturalism. Any of these types of life, any particular set of these mental properties, could potentially be instantiated either physically or non-physically. However, nearly all of them won't be able to be instantiated under our current laws of physics. So this means that if we assume fixed laws, like we fix the laws of physics as they are, then the probability of a physical universe is very, very low, because almost all of the types of life that God might have reason to create just won't be possible. So to illustrate this, under naturalism, we have, imagine this is a fraction that is an illustrative way of indicating the relative probability of different types of universes. There's only a small number of constants that allow for the existence of life, given all of the possible constants, again, conditional on a fixed set of laws. However, that probability is still much greater than the small set of physically instantiable or physically realizable types of minds relative to all of the types of minds that God might have reason to create. And again, it's important to realize here that we're counting possibilities differently under naturalism than under theism, and that's by nature of the hypotheses. Under naturalism, we count possibilities on the basis of possible constants and which of those can allow the existence of physical life. Under theism, we count the possible types of minds based on the mental properties that I discussed before, because these are the relevant decisions that God has to make in terms of what types of minds he has moral reasons to create. God's not interested in physical constants in and of themselves. He's interested in morally salient differences between types of minds. But if we evaluate those, we realize that there are a huge range of possible types of minds that God might want to create, especially when you consider that not all of the minds he might want to create would have the same set of mental properties, so there's this interaction effect. Almost all of these types of minds, I've argued, will not be physically instantiable given our laws of physics. And so it's exceptionally unlikely that under theism you would expect any physical universe at all, because God is almost certainly going to create a type of life that won't be physically instantiable. Now, what if we relax this assumption about keeping the laws of physics constants, and instead we allow the possibility for different physical laws, not just different constants, but different forms of the equations? Well, the first thing to note here is that we don't really know if the fine-tuning argument would even hold in this setup when we allow both laws and the constants to vary. It's quite possible that the probability of a life-permitting set of constants and laws is much, much greater than the probability of life-permitting constants given the set of laws that we actually do have. This second probability is a conditional probability, assuming the laws are fixed, whereas the first one is a joint probability over constants and laws. And as far as we know, the first probability could be much, much greater than the second, because we really know nothing about what would be possible under the vast majority of possible alternate physical laws. And that's usually why you see that fine-tuning proponents just assume that the laws are fixed. They just fix the laws of physics as they are, because we can't really say much of anything about what would happen if we allowed the laws of physics to vary. But I would argue further than this that it's still conceptually, I think, reasonable to assume or to think that the most combinations of mental properties will not be instantiable in any physical universe, even if you allow ones with different physical laws. Obviously, if we're talking different physical laws, then there are going to be much more possibilities than if we're just considering our own set of physical laws. But conceptually speaking, remember that under naturalism, even with any set of physical laws, in order for life to exist, there still has to be a set of equations that describe interactions between particles, fields, or something like that, exchanging conserved quantities. The exact conserved quantities might be different if the equations were different, but to count as physical in the way that I understand that, and in the way that fine-tuning proponents describe physical universes, it would still have to fall under that framework. Now, that's a fairly restrictive framework. Any other type of entity that God could create and endow with physical powers would be outside of that framework. And so it just seems that, conceptually speaking, there are many, many, many more possible types of realities that could exist and minds that could exist that are not physically instantiable compared to those that are physically instantiable. So I illustrate that in this diagram by indicating that, when we allow the possibility that there are laws that vary, not just the constants, then we're definitely going to have more possibilities for life-permitting universes. We don't really know how many. That's why I put the question mark here. And likewise, we don't really know how many physically instantiable types of minds there will be. There certainly will be more, because now we've got an extra aspect that can be varied, which is the laws themselves. But conceptually speaking, because the types of minds that are naturally realizable is much more constrained than those that aren't, it's still very reasonable, I think, to assume that the proportion of possible minds that God might want to create that are physically instantiable is much, much lower than the total number of possible minds. And this is especially when we consider the fact that I mentioned earlier, and I'll just remind you, that we're not just talking about a mind in isolation. Under naturalism, there's always one set of laws, one set of constants that all of the minds that exist in a given universe must operate under. That's how naturalism works. That's the assumption, right? But God doesn't have to obey that assumption. He can make all sorts of different types of minds that have totally different sets of mental parameters, each one of which in isolation might be able to exist in its own physical universe, but he can bring them all together and just make a single universe that they all can interact within. Because he doesn't have to make an underlying set of physical equations with particles and fields interacting through exchanging conserved quantities. He doesn't have to do that in order to instantiate these forms of life. He can just make the different forms of life and endow them with the right types of causal powers to interact with each other to whatever degree and whatever manner he wants to. And so you get this combinatorial problem that even if an individual set of parameters, mental properties, might be possible to exist under some set of physical laws, the combination of them almost certainly won't. Because, again, God has much, much greater flexibility for the possible range of these combinations than exists under naturalism. So this means that if we treat naturalism and theism consistently using a similar framework for assessing the number of possibilities and the probability of observing the outcome that we do, fine-tuning actually favors naturalism, or a naturalistic universe. We may still agree that the fine-tuning of life-allowing constants given laws in naturalism is very low, which is what the proponents of the fine-tuning argument contend. I've argued against that, but even if we assume that, I've argued here that the probability of life-allowing constants given the existing laws and theism is very, very low. It's even lower. And that means that the probability of life-allowing constants under theism compared to the probability of life-allowing constants under naturalism is much, much less than 1, the opposite of what theists argue. And therefore, fine-tuning actually supports naturalism over theism, according to this argument that I'm making. And specifically, it's the fact that we have physical laws at all, specifically, that provides evidence for naturalism, because that's extremely unexpected under theism. Theism strongly predicts non-physical laws, because if you add up all of the different ways that God may want to create life, based on the moral reasons that theists tell us that God has for creating life, the vast majority of the resulting possibilities will not be physically instantiable. Certainly under our current set of laws, definitely most of them won't be physically realizable. But even allowing for different sets of laws, I argue that it must be the case that the number of possible types of combinations of minds that God might want to create vastly exceeds those that can be instantiated in any physically realizable universe, just given how much more restrictive physical universes are compared to non-physical universes. So the conclusion is here, if God creates the universe in order to allow for the existence of morally valuable minds that can interact with each other and grow and learn and experience and so forth, and all those things that Swinburne mentioned, then applying the same framework that theists do in order to develop the fine-tuning argument, what we arrive at is that there is a vast array of different possibilities in terms of types of minds that God would want to create, and a combinatorially greater possible combination of those types of sets of minds with sets of mental properties that he might want to create. And the vast majority of those will not be possible in any physical universe. God could create them, but he couldn't instantiate a physical universe that allows them to exist, because their existence would require types of laws, types of powers that are inconsistent with the very specific, very constrained set of assumptions about what constitutes a physical universe. As a result, the vast majority of universes which God, as far as we know, would have reason to create, would not be physical universes. They would be non-physical universes with non-physical minds in them. And hence a physical universe of any sort is highly, highly unexpected under theism, given these assumptions as we've discussed. And this turns the fine-tuning argument back against theism, that it seems that the existence of a physical universe is just incredibly unlikely, even if you assume that God wants to create minds that have moral value in the way that Swinburne explained. And this is why I think the fine-tuning argument is really just an incredibly bad argument, because the only way you can get it to work is to go through a detailed analysis of the range of constants and which possible ranges, values of the constants allow for the existence of life, assuming that life can only emerge through certain sets of interactions of fundamental particles and so on, as we've discussed. You get that probability, and then you just stop. You completely fail to give any analysis of how you get the probability of a physically fine-tuned universe under theism. I'm arguing in this video that if you do the second step, if you go through that analysis in a similar procedure for theism, you actually find that a fine-tuned physical universe is even less likely under theism than it is under naturalism. And so the fine-tuning argument, if anything, is an argument for naturalism and against theism. So if you disagree, feel free to make a video response or send a written response to my email address, fods12@gmail.com. Always happy to do discussions on my channel to nut out these issues and discuss them a bit more, particularly because this is, as far as I know, a novel counter. So it is probably going to be subject to substantive disagreement, I imagine, and people wanting to tell me why I'm wrong. So feel free to do that, and hopefully we can keep the discussion going. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time.